So I'm going to talk about a case study that I think is a very real-life example of how sleep training can go sometimes. I don't have any data. They sent me some notes in a chat. That's how we communicated. To me, that's data. To me, lived experience is data. A parent telling me how things are going is data. So it's a bit of a different one because we had a couple of hiccups, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. This was a case study that was very parent-driven, and I really was just a resource. I was just on the other side of the phone answering questions, providing suggestions, being a sounding board, checking in, etc. Parents did all of the legwork, which is usually the case with this type of treatment. So I'll go a little bit over the case description. So this was a little one, preschooler, autistic, and ADHD. Wasn't in school yet, so just started this year. And sleep problems had been in place for a while, 1.5 to 2 years. Had some okay sleep before then, but sleep became really problematic. And then it got better for a little bit, and then they moved, some other life events occurred, and it got worse again. So this was a sleep problem where the child needed the parent to fall asleep. One parent in particular, so parents also did the routines a little bit differently. So this child needed a parent to be in the room, laying down with them in order to fall asleep. And if that were the case, they would fall asleep pretty quickly within 10 minutes or so. If that wasn't the case, it could take them upward to a half hour or an hour to fall asleep. And that usually included some getting out of bed, pulling things out of drawers, wrecking the room a little bit, even though there wasn't a lot in there, which usually resulted in the parent having to close the door and sit outside, prevent the child from leaving, and it just created stress for everybody. So at the height of all of this, with multiple night wakings, the child staying up for longer periods at night, coming into their bedroom, nobody was sleeping, the doctor suggested medication. And so to sleep, the family chose to use clonidine and also 10 milligrams of melatonin. And then everybody slept for a little bit, which was great. And then the family reached out, wanting to fade the medication, but not really knowing where to start, because knowing that when you fade the medication, you're going to head right back to the same sleep problem that was in place before. So we talked a little bit about parent goals, and not surprisingly, one would be sleep through the night. So getting a good amount of sleep, sleeping as long as you need to, but sleeping through the night, falling asleep on their own in their own room, and fading out medication. So those were the 3 main goals that we tackled. We had to talk about how we were going to go about doing this. So when you're fading medication, one of the first things we talked about was, let's get in touch with the doctor, let's have a conversation with the team, let's make sure we have a backup plan should the delivery of clonidine in the night impact things going on in the day. So let's just make sure we understand all the moving parts before we move forward. So we talked a little bit about the general bedtime routine. And overall, it was a pretty healthy routine. Didn't really watch TV before bed, played quietly with different things in the hour before bed, was really cooperative with the entire bedtime routine, was able to go up, brush teeth, pajamas. With each parent, the routine looked a little bit different. So one, it was more laying, cuddling, chatting. The other, it was reading books, but was able to do all of that. And then it was the parent leaving the room that was the problem. And they'd pretty much figured out that if the child wasn't asleep within 10 minutes, chances are he wasn't going to fall asleep anytime soon. So they knew that it was going to be a bit of a longer night. And so there's kind of plan B kicked in, which was trying to clear the room and leaving the room, and just trying to create kind of a block so that the child wasn't able to leave the room. So we tightened up the routine a little bit just with timing. So we talked a little bit about just spacing out dinner and bedtime, making sure there's at least 2 hours in between there. So we talked a little bit about the timing. We talked a little bit about being aware of liquid intake. because at times when the child woke at night, they were either wet or had to use the washroom. So just being aware of water intake and trying to cut that down in the hour before bed. It doesn't mean not giving water. It just means maybe giving not as much, maybe just a few sips, because sometimes water can be part of the routine. We've definitely worked with kids where having that drink of water is something I do in my bedtime routine, and it was a matter of bringing it down a little bit. We ask that they dim lights just to make sure, again, that melatonin piece is strong, that we're getting some strong cues that it's time to sleep. So dimming lights a little bit more and making sure that they're in a room where they're able to do that, because one room you kind of weren't, if you couldn't dim the lights, and if you turned them off, you were in pitch black. Another one, you're able to dim them a little bit. So shifting the routine a little bit and where that playtime was occurring before bed. Dimming the lights, calming activities, tightening up that pre-bed routine, but leaving the individuality for each parent to do what was important for them to do with their child, and also what the child associated with them and wanted to do with them. So it didn't have to be the same routine with each parent necessarily, but we wanted the timing to be the same. We wanted that routine to be no more than 15 minutes, where it was really quick, really condensed, and then fading out. We talked about the fading of medication with the doctor who guided them on how to fade the clonidine itself across a week. Parents chose to do that during a camping trip they had because typically the child slept really well camping, outdoors, doing all sorts of fun things. And so they were really hoping that that would kind of counteract fading out the clonidine at bedtime, which it did. It went quite well during the camping trip, and we had scheduled to start a couple days after they got home. And they did notice when they got home, there were a couple of later nights where he was up until at least 1 a.m. And so they did have a couple of rough nights. We had talked about that ahead of time. We had talked about the risks and benefits of maintaining the medication versus fading the medication. They really did express that they'd used medication as a need. Everybody needed to sleep, but they didn't want to keep it long term. So we knew that we were going to be fading it. That was a wish of theirs. The challenge with the medication is paired with the melatonin. One, we weren't really sure whether the melatonin was doing anything, and it was a pretty high dose. So both of those together, we weren't really sure what the melatonin was doing. It's important to answer that question, because if you don't need to be on a supplement or a medication, you shouldn't be. So we needed to answer that question. Feeding out the clonidine as well as you start to fade would give me a better idea of what the sleep problem actually was and get a better sense of where his sleep pressure is at bedtime, because essentially when you take medication, you are sedated, you fall asleep very quickly. So it's tough to gauge whether or not you're sleepy because of sleep pressure or you're sleepy because this medication has been introduced. And we weren't sure what other issues would pop up with fading out the medication. Parents had reported prior the bedtime routine went okay, so participation in the bedtime routine went okay. It was more the parent leaving that tended to be the problem. So we had a couple of rough nights. We were communicating about that, and then we knew we were going to start the following night. So we did something called time-based visiting, and technically for those of you would be non-contingent reinforcement. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm going to explain this all, but I'm not going to get super technical. If any of the professionals have specific questions about this, we're going to ask that you email us directly, and we're happy to talk about it further. But I'm not going to get super technical about it. So time-based visiting is a way of fading a parent out of a room, or perhaps fading a child out of another room. I'm going to go over the risks and benefits, generally what the procedure looks like, some considerations for modifications that you can make, what it looked like for this family and this child, how things went, and just generally our experience with this procedure, which for the most part has been good. The majority of times that we've used this procedure, it's gone really well. Other times we've known the first night it's not going to be a good fit and just pivoted and switched gears. So essentially what time-based visiting means is that we set up intervals, and here is an example of what an interval might look like or fading might look like. So on the first night, your first step, if it's a step. So one of the modifications we can make here is time-based visiting would be I exit the room and come back in at a set time. Sometimes kids can't even handle that. I know mine, for example, when we started, this is what I did with my 4-year-old. And the second, I even put my hand on the door, I could hear like the pitter patter of feet right behind me. I don't know how he did it that fast, but he was literally at my back within like a split second. And so in that case, you probably need to go and break it down even further. So that could mean that you need to go right to the bed and you're just fading from the bed. I'm taking 1 step back, 2 steps back, and I'm slowly, gradually getting myself to the door. And then I'm able to start moving further, and now I'm able to insert my time delay. So a traditional time delay the first night, you would start at a 1-second interval. And what that would look like is tuck, good night, be right back, leave, close the door, or door ajar, whatever is going to work best. 1,000. Go back in, meaningful tuck in. Super proud of you, you stayed in bed, that's great. Whatever's meaningful for the child at that point. Tuck, be right back, leave. Now you're counting 5 seconds. Could be 3 seconds, could be 2 seconds. The intervals can vary. This is part of the problem solving that we do the night of, is talking about, and as we do the implementation, is really just figuring out where is that sweet spot for implementation, what's the interval that's going to work best right now. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the idea is you're fading your intervals, 1 second, 5 second, 10 second. And as long as the child's staying in bed for that interval, you come back in and you provide some meaningful attention, right? Whatever it is it looks like for them. If the child gets out of bed, that's considered an error. That's a trial we need to redo. So you do go in because you need to put them back to bed. You try to minimize your interaction at that point. It's, more of a, oh, you need to stay in bed. We're not talking neutral. We're not talking mean. We're not talking stern. You're just not as exciting as you were the time before. So we're going in, again, keeping things really gentle, really calm. Oh, you need to stay in bed, putting them in bed, quicker tuck in, leaving, going back to 1 second. The idea of going back to a shorter interval is really to ensure the child's successful. As much as possible, you want the child to stay in bed, because the longer they stay in bed with you coming back in and going out, the more they're pairing bed with the relaxed state, the more they're staying in bed and getting ready for sleep. If you're encountering a lot of in and out, I'm getting out of bed, I'm getting back in, I'm getting out of bed, you're starting to wake up various systems in your body, and the chances of that child kind of getting calm again is probably not going to happen too easily, especially if you're trying to get them to stay in bed. So we try to keep the intervals as short as needed so that the child meets reinforcement. That child stays in bed, mom or dad comes back, we get to hang out again for a little bit, and then they leave again. The idea behind time-based visiting is there's no need for you to come out and get me. There's no need for you to get out of your bed and maybe mess around with your room or cry out for me, because I'm coming back anyway. So it kind of reduces the value of all of that. You don't need to do any of that because I'm coming back. So just stay in bed and we can hang out together. That's the best fit for this procedure, is a child that is getting out of bed or is maybe disruptive in the bedroom, not able to fall asleep right away, really wanting a parent to stay. That's where this is the best fit. So you fade out through the night, and it's some back and forth. One of the, not necessarily risks, but I would say cons to this procedure is it's a lot of work for a parent. We try to make it as simple as possible. Our data sheet that they do take, which parents actually want to take the data because it keeps them on track and they know which interval they're on, is circling. So it's just circling where they're at so that they know when to increase, when to decrease. And typically after a first or second night, parents do the rest of it on their own, and they're just checking in every morning. So the first night, you're fading out from a 1 second. The next night, your first interval would be a bit longer. the next night a little bit longer, and that's how you start to fade it across a week or so. And typically we can fade the intervals out within 2 weeks. Usually the biggest reaction you get is the first night, and that's the night where you really get a sense of whether this is going to be a good fit. The idea behind this procedure is that it is meant to be more gentle. It is a little bit more responsive to the child and how they're doing. We don't want a child that's incredibly anxious or a person laying in bed stressing about when a parent's going to come back. We have implemented this with a few kids where we always talk with the parent in the beginning. Let's talk about the difference between I don't like this is happening, right? Like I have an opinion about this. I don't like this. You're changing my habits. You're changing my routines, and I don't like this. Versus this is stressful for me. I am distressed, and this is really upsetting, and I'm having like a physiological response to that. Because we don't want that. So there have been a couple instances where we've talked to the parent ahead of time. Your eyes were not there, and you know your child, you're the expert. If you're feeling like your child is tipping a little bit towards distress, stop. Do what you can to calm them. That may mean laying down with them for a minute. That may mean singing a song. It could mean getting a glass of water, preferably you bringing it to them rather than them leaving the room. Something that just resets a little bit. Calm down, and then we start again. So we're never going to push through distress or anxiety. We aren't going to push to the point where a child is so anxious that there's really no way they're going to fall asleep, or they're going to fall asleep because they're so mentally and physically exhausted. That's not the point. So sometimes this can take a little bit longer. Right? So that is definitely one of the risks or cons, is that this procedure can take a little bit longer to do, both the night of or the night that it's being done, as well as the couple weeks that it may take to get to a better place. But for the most part, within the first few nights, we've seen kids are able to stay in bed, and then we're just fading out the intervals. So for this case in particular, the first night, coming off of a camping trip, coming off of 2 nights of wonky sleep because we'd faded medication, the parents at one point decided we can't, we need to sleep. We're both exhausted, and this is taking a while, which we knew it would. But I always give parents permission, right? Because sometimes we need to give ourselves some grace. If you really feel you need to stop, we're going to. I'm not even going to ask parents to push through their anxiety or their huge sleep deprivation either. And in hindsight, realized that maybe that wasn't the greatest first night to start, because everybody was tired and the chances of being able to kind of support the child at that time just wasn't there. So what ended up happening with the intervals is we had the first few intervals going really well as the child was like, what's going on? And it went really well. And then when parents switched out, and that kind of prompted a bit of a different interaction, and that started to increase alertness. The child started to wake up a little bit and engage in some other behaviors like, I think it was doing somersaults, headstands, leaning out and like touching the floor with one finger. Yeah, it was funny. So kind of doing some things like that. And so the parents were like, this is happening. Like, yeah, we anticipated this might happen. And just the back and forth, they were honestly exhausted and tapped out. And that was okay. It's like, great, let's reconnect in the morning, come up with a game plan and start again. So that's what we did. And the next night went really well. And the night after that went really well. And the night after that went really well. We ended up encountering another hiccup, which was more a family emergency type situation where the child's routine was off for a couple of nights. They still did the time-based visiting. It just was at a much later time because the child was going to bed a bit later. And then we just asked that they maintain the wake up. So even though the child's going to bed a little bit later, let's maintain the wake up so that when you are able to do your typical bedtime, which they wanted to get back to and they knew that they would get back to, he would be tired enough. So you wouldn't be looking at him horsing around at bedtime. He'd be tired enough that he would go to sleep. So that's where we left it. This is ongoing. And at this point, the procedure itself worked well. Parents felt really comfortable with it once it got going. The data, again, that they were sending me was on a piece of paper, took a picture, sent it to me in the morning or that night after the kiddo had fallen asleep, and reviewed it, kind of asked some questions, gave a little bit of feedback or answered any questions, and then moved on to the next night. So this was one where they really took over once they'd gotten the gist of it and once they were comfortable with it. So we also had the night wakings popping up. And what we started to see, we sort of talked about previously, once he was able to put himself to sleep and didn't need an adult there, the night wakings did go down. They didn't disappear entirely, which is usually the case. It can take a little bit. But they did start to decrease in frequency for sure. And he was sleeping through the night more so. We talked a little bit about options of what to do with the night waking. So in the night waking, he would go into the parent's bed. And two things were happening. Either they noticed or they didn't. So the challenge with not noticing, and I will say my 4-year-old does this as well. Sometimes I'll wake up and there he is. The challenge with not noticing is you can't really do much about it unless you somehow attach a bell to the door or you set up something that wakes you up when either they enter the room or they leave their room. So we talked a bit about like, okay, so him coming in and you not noticing and going back to sleep right away, everybody else staying asleep, all else working. Do you want to fix this? And the answer was no, we're good. I said, great. That's also a decision I made in our family, so great, we won't touch it. If they do wake up, are you going to put them back to bed or are you just going to let them come into your bed? And the decision at that time was we're just going to leave it for now and just focus on the independent sleep. And we may revisit that, I'm not sure. We'll see what happens there. One of the other variables is, and some other things that are popping up, is transferring to grandparents' home because either on weekends or at certain times in the week, they also go to their grandparents' home. And so grandparents agreed. We sort of did we'll work on this at home, then we'll transfer it to grandparent, then we'll work on this other thing at home, transfer it to grandparent. So we've kind of pushed night waking and are just focusing on transferring that independent bedtime to the grandparent's home. Our next step is going to be feeding the melatonin, which I suggested talking with a pharmacist. Because melatonin's not a medication, it's a hormone and it's synthetic, and we'll talk about medication too in another slide. I suggested talking with a pharmacist or a doctor about fading melatonin, but typically in my experience, their advice is it's fairly easy to fade. You don't actually need to do it too systematically, but it's always important to talk with a doctor or pharmacist about that. So the next step will be feeding the melatonin. Their hunch is that it hasn't had a huge impact because it was initially given to address night wakings, and melatonin itself will not help with night wakings. Melatonin helps with the timing of sleep onset. It doesn't help with sustaining sleep. So we suspect the melatonin isn't going to have a huge impact, and we'll probably be able to fade it fairly easily. And then the last step will be to ensure that we're maintaining it. So we want to make sure that it's maintained across both parent home as well as grandparent home. Question? So a couple questions, and we're going to do the next case study. One would need to consolidate sleep prior to fading parent, or if the parent is a sleep aid, do they need to happen simultaneously? By fading a parent out and increasing independence at falling asleep, chances are the result will be a consolidation of sleep. Because once you, especially in this situation, because it was a sleep dependency, because the child really couldn't fall asleep, could eventually fall asleep without somebody there, but it took a long time and it was upsetting for everybody, and then was seeking out a parent when they woke up. So it seemed to be a sleep dependency. So by fixing that, they were able to sleep through the night more often. And again, this is still fairly new and we're working on it. So they were able to sleep through the night without seeking out a parent at night. So by tackling fading parent, we ended up having a good result with consolidation of sleep. The next question, how does one start time-based visiting when the current situation is laying with the child until they are asleep? So that was the situation in this case, is a parent would lay with them until they fell asleep. And that usually happened within 10 minutes. If it didn't, they kind of knew it was going to be one of those nights where we were going to be up a little bit later. So you would start time-based visiting really by working on answering a couple of questions. One, what's meaningful to the child in terms of the attention that they're getting? Is it the laying down? Is it cuddling? Is it songs? What is it that they're seeking? Making sure you give them that prior to bedtime. So making sure you are spending a good amount of time with them before leaving the room, and then providing that when they stay in bed. So fading out, coming back in, providing that attention, leaving again a little bit longer, coming back in. So you're able to do that because, again, this was the case with this family as well, that they laid there until the child fell asleep. I've also worked with other families in the same situation where they'll lay with their children for up to an hour until they fall asleep as well. The other piece that we did in this case as well, which we typically do with a time-based visiting choice, is we push bedtime a little bit past when a child typically falls asleep. Not past bedtime, but when they typically fall asleep, because we want to make sure sleep pressure is really high. We want to make sure that the child is ready for sleep. So if we start with a regular bedtime, it doesn't tend to go as well. We do want to push it a little bit just to increase sleep pressure a little bit, and then start that fading out, if that makes sense.